Thank you for coming. Let's start. Simon is a curator and a historian, and as you know, they have way too much to say. So usually, we're going to start as soon as possible. Thank you for coming. It's really an honor to have Simon here. I'm going to read some stuff that I read every time, but each time I try to remind you what it is, why it is that we're here, and partly it's because a lot of great people have funded a program, and I will mention them now, that allows us to bring in some of the best and the brightest in the field of art and contemporary photography. And also, we do that because we honor a man who was our friend and colleague and our teacher here, and that's Larry Sultan. Larry was an inspiration to so many people, and you will see that in the people who he has affected, and I am one of them, and many of the people in this room are there too. A matter of fact, next week on Wednesday, LACMA will be opening the first and probably only major retrospective of Larry's work in Los Angeles, which will be traveling all over the world, I hope. And you please come and see it if you can in your travels to LA, as I think you'll see in person why Larry was so important to us all. The visiting artist program is really a collaboration. That's something I'm also very proud of, because these are organizations that don't always work together, and it's Pier 24, it's San Francisco MoMA, and it's our grade school CCA. And there's also within that a group of people who fund it every year, and every year we work to try to get more people involved so we can fund more things and do more projects like this. And that's Pier 24 photography, Bob and Randy Fisher, Robert Maley Anderson and Nicola Miner, Nyan McAvoy, and the Black Dog Private Foundation. This is the second to last lecture that we have. We have one more this semester. Next one will be on November 13th with David Levi-Strauss, who many of you might know as a kind of a award-winning critic and writer, and he's based in New York, although he used to live here, and I liked him better then because I liked hanging out with him. He's the chair of the graduate program in art and criticism and writing at SVA. He writes essays for Art Forum, Aperture, Art in America, The Nation, blah, 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 blah. This year he just did a book with Aperture, and it was called Words Not Spent Today by, B-U-I, Smaller Images Tomorrow. And it's a series of essays that he's done on various people and that he's looked at over the years. But today we have someone very different. We have someone who flew across the ocean, which is hard, which is great in itself, but he's doing it right before he's installing a show. A major show. It's probably your first big major one there, or is Mariama and Klein? No, it's not. Okay, it's the second major show. But I'm in the show, so I think it's a major show. And let me tell you a little bit about him. Okay, first, when you used to go to the Tate and show them your work, they didn't have a photography curator. They would put you would be sent to a person who dealt with collections, who was a really nice person, but she had no idea what photography was. She said, well, listen, I really like your work, and I'll bring it up, but we really don't know what to do with photography, so come back when we get a curator. We're probably going to get one within the next couple of years. They did, and that's Simon Baker. He is the first curator of photography at the Tate Modern, and it's a great thing for all of us. He is in charge not only of organizing shows, but building a collection. And building a collection is not an easy thing when you're starting sort of from scratch. And I don't know if he'll talk about that, but if he doesn't, I would love it if someone in the audience were to ask him what that entails. He used to teach at Nottingham. He was at Princeton. He did all these things. But the important things is what he wrote me earlier today. And that is, he's written on a lot of things, and he's done lots of exhibitions. The last one was William Klein and Daido Moriyama. He drinks and smokes too much. He's 1/4 Moroccan and part Jewish, although one would never know that. He's a Sagittarius. He thought that was enough for you all to know tonight. So without further ado, let's bring Simon Baker. Cheers.
Okay, so thanks, Jim. I'd like to thank CCA very, very much for inviting me here to speak. I'm really honored to be part of a program which is associated with Larry Sultan. Is somebody who I have enormous respect for, and somebody whose work we have in Tate's collection. In fact, one of the few photographers whose work we have in Tate's collection. And very, very happy to be here with Jim Goldberg, who's somebody who's very special as a photographer, but also somebody whose work we're very happy to include in the show that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the exhibition we're mounting at the end of November. It's called Conflict Time Photography. And it's as Jim said, one of the big shows, photo shows that we're planning at Tate. I've got the talk organized in two halves, and I hope you'll bear with me. The first half is me reading something, and the reason that I've written a speech, I wouldn't usually do that, but it's sort of 3 in the morning for me at the moment, so I was worried that I would just come up here and freeze or fall asleep, or both. So I have prepared something a little more formal, and then afterwards I will happily talk through some of the other ideas in the show and answer any questions that you have. The first image that I've put up on the screen is a work that's been made for the show. It's actually a poster that we're going to sell associated with the exhibition. It's by Adam Brumberg and Oliver Chanarin, two of the younger artists in the show. And it shows the city of Dresden, and superimposed over the city of Dresden are lines from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the show and the ideas behind it, and why I think Kurt Vonnegut's ideas are very important for photography in general in relation to this exhibition. So I'll start with a quote from Slaughterhouse-Five. "People aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I've finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure, and it had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time." So, as most of you will know, I hope most of you have read Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut was present during the firebombing of Dresden in February 1945, when tens of thousands of people were killed. He was locked in a meat locker underground in a slaughterhouse as a prisoner of war, and he emerged the morning after the air raid, to find the city destroyed. And 24 years later, so in 1969, he finally published his war book. And for a long time, as he struggled to write the book, later admitting, "I must have written 5,000 pages and thrown them all away," the title of the book was going to be Armageddon in retrospect. The central problem of his book, both for the author and for the reader, is that of looking backwards in time without becoming frozen and numb. The pillar of salt, which is from the biblical story of the wife of Lot, who's punished for turning round to look at Sodom and Gomorrah. So Vonnegut's solution then is a very unlikely and radical one, was to destroy time itself. So his protagonist in the book, Billy Pilgrim, comes unstuck in time. And he slips without warning between the post-war present, the wartime past, which includes Dresden, and a future where he lives on a planet called Tralfamadore, where flying saucers come from, apparently. Vonnegut, however, was not unique in identifying this problem and in taking his time with the past. So after the Second World War, retrospect was a vital ingredient for many writers who were thinking about the war, but who has also been closely involved in the action. So Joseph Heller, who you all know all very well, was an Air Force bombardier and actually a pupil of Vonnegut's. So he published Catch-22 in 1961. While J.G. Ballard, who wrote Empire of the Sun, which was about his experience as a prisoner of war in Shanghai. He published that in 1984, so these different amounts of time after the event. And in 2014, so in this year, it's a century after the start of the First World War in Europe, in the absence of any living survivors, the problem of looking backwards continues to deepen. And our idea for the exhibition was really to think not just about how to make pictures of conflict, but how to look backwards at conflict. And there are many more or less sensitive ways to do this, and you see this very much in Britain at the moment with the sort of centenary activity. So this problem of looking backwards continues to deepen, and events and individuals are frozen like bugs in amber, which is Vonnegut's way of putting it, that we see only slightly through the reverse telescope of history. So inspired by the fact that photographers, like writers, have made significant bodies of work about the after effects of war in the short, medium, and the long terms, the exhibition, Conflict Time Photography, takes as its starting point the necessity and value of the time taken to consider the past, looking beyond the instantaneity of photojournalism to consider images of war and conflict made after the fact. So both the exhibition and the book, and I'm going to show you by way of slides, I'm going to show you pages from the book. The works are arranged in the same way, so they're sequenced according to the distance from the events or from the ends of the conflicts that they concern. So we start off with photographs made moments after something's happened, then move gradually through images of days after things have happened, then weeks, months, and years afterwards. And this stretching of the vantage point, which artists and photographers have looked back from, moves onwards through years and decades, like the 24 years it took Vonnegut to write Slaughterhouse 5. And then finally we reach works at the end of the exhibition made 100 years after the events to which they relate. And it includes things from the 19th century when photography was a new medium, but also so from the Crimean and the American Civil War, and then the two World Wars, and then to really recent events in Africa and the Middle East. So the aim of this non-chronological strategy is to unstick time and see the past as Billy Pilgrim saw it, shifting perspectives constantly from contemporary conflicts to those in distant history, and then in all points in between, across time and space. From Afghanistan to Hiroshima, the Western Front to Vietnam, Nicaragua to Iraq, Berlin to the Crimea, and so on. And many of the works included necessarily share the spirit of Vonnegut's return to wartime Dresden in the 60s, engaging with, rather than seeking to bridge, the impossible passage of time. In the words of one critic writing about Japanese photography in the 1960s that were thinking about the Second World War, this work, as he puts it, asks us to see through the now that it is showing us into the then that pervades the now and gives it its meaning. So as this characterization suggests, although there are many examples of photographic projects that engage with Vonnegut's attitude to representing the passage of time made about different conflicts in different places and after different delays, maybe the clearest equivalent instance of this time travel, this kind of time travel, was made in Japan about its experience of mass civilian casualties. So from the late 1950s to the early 70s, about 15 to 25 years after the end of the Second World War, some of the most significant and original photo books ever published took as their subject the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So just as Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5 transcended the idea of a war book to become a classic of 20th century literature, so Kendamon's Hiroshima, Kakuji Kawada's The Map, Shomei Tomatsu's 1102 Nagasaki have come to be regarded as among the most important photographic publications of the post-war period, apart from Jim's books, obviously. I know, it goes without saying. Just make that come back on again. So the correlations between Vonnegut's account of Dresden and, for example, Kawada's account of Hiroshima, The Map, or Tomatsu's account of Nagasaki, run far beyond the shocking coincidence of the subjects, so mass civilian casualties visited upon the population of authoritarian regimes. They point instead to something significant and different about the author's responses to the disconnects between places, people, and the events that have come to define them. So Vonnegut, Kawada, and Tomatsu, returning to these hugely symbolic cities in the 60s, had to search for ways to describe and explain not only what had happened there, but why somehow it was still happening all these years later. So each was caught in the half-lives of the original events. Vonnegut was still enthralled to his experiences in 1945 when he wrote, characteristically deadpan, about returning to Dresden in 1967. He says, "It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio. More open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground." While for Kawada, Tomatsu, and many Japanese photographers who sought to document Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the late 50s onwards, the radioactive nature of the original event was present everywhere on a daily basis, in the lives of those who survived the events only to live or die in the horror of its aftermath. Tomatsu put it as follows in 1961. I quote, "Time has passed in the outside world since it stopped for Nagasaki at 2 minutes past 11 on August the 9th, 16 years ago. But every victim who has died since acts as a link to join that moment with the present. What I saw in Nagasaki was not merely the scars of war, it was a place where the post-war period had never ended. I thought that the term ruins only referred to the devastated form of cities, but Nagasaki taught me that it could also be applied to human beings." While Kawada, whose photo book The Map was published on August the 6th, 1965, 20 years precisely since the bombing of Hiroshima, recounts fearfully his first visit to the city in 1959 through a series of references to the problems of vision. I quote, "A veil of morning mist left me unable to see anything," he says about a post-war Hiroshima populated by, he talks about there being lots of visually impaired people with slightly opaque and abnormal eyes. And at the ground zero of the blast, he says, there was not one person remaining who could testify to the great scene of the vanished city. And there's echoes here of the, I don't know how many of you know the film, Alan Resnay's film, Hiroshima Mon Amour, where it starts with two lovers in bed, and the first things you hear, depending on how good your French is, the first thing you read, if you read the subtitles, are, "You saw nothing in Hiroshima, nothing." And the other voice says, "I saw everything, everything." And both this and Kawada's text reflect this kind of balance between disappearance and persistence, in both physical and psychological terms, between that which is lost and that which remains, a thread running through any such attempts to represent the trauma of conflict after the fact. In visual terms especially, the problematic tension of using photography to represent the past introduces a powerful dialectic of visible and invisible forms. I think that the really nice description of photographs that Daido Moriyama uses, which is fossils of light, is a really nice way to encapsulate the sense in which the physical and the impalpable coexist in the essence of the photographic medium. So what does it mean, we might ask, to expect a photograph to reach across time and space and fulfill its obligation to represent something adequately or even at all? Paul Virilio, whose important study of the remains of wartime architecture, bunker archaeology, includes a section entitled The Aesthetics of Disappearance, has said, and I quote, "War is not only amoral, but also experimental. Experimental in the way that it inverts production. The machines of war," he says, "are producers of accidents, disappearances, breakdowns, designed to make the enemy disappear." And some of the strangest and most moving photographs of conflict are those where the photographer has arrived, as so many did in the aftermath of the First World War, to find only the place where something used to be, evidence only of an absence. Pushed by a compulsion to demonstrate the terminal destructiveness of war on society to a burgeoning audience of tourists, the response at that time was often to photograph a place that wasn't there anymore, and then you just have a caption that says, "Previously the village of," or the site of the chateau of, but the places themselves have gone. And such tensions are also evident everywhere in the examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which not only offer a broad scope of photographic imagery, from that made moments, hours, and days after the bombings to work made over a century later, but also in the midst of which we find the subtlety and the sophistication of visual reflections on the past by artists like Kawada and Tomatsu. And I'm just going to go through some of the examples from Hiroshima and Nagasaki when I switch this over. I'm going to try and be technically competent. There we go. Okay. So what I'll do, I'll just show some of the examples from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to give a sense of how the exhibition works, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the other images. So don't worry if I whiz past things that look interesting. Or maybe I'm whizzing past things that don't look interesting. But we'll see. So From the moment of the event, images of the unseen and absent came to stand for what could not be shown. So Toshio Fukada's sequence of photographs of the mushroom cloud, less than 20 minutes after the explosion of Hiroshima, is an image that cannot possibly represent what it depicts, replicating the fact that anybody who'd witnessed the sudden massive flash of the bomb would have lost their sight, if not their life. While, on the other hand, Matsumoto Aichi's Shadow of a Soldier, taken days after Nagasaki, likewise replaces the unimaginable horror of instantaneous incineration with the slightest suggestion of a charcoal outline of a crouching human form. I hope you can see that on the bottom there, burned into the side of a wooden wall. What I'm showing you is essentially the PDF of the proofs of the catalogue, and you can follow, those of you with very good eyesight anyway, at the bottom right-hand side it will tell you how long after the event these things have happened. So there it says weeks later. And the book is arranged in a very simple way, so it says days later, weeks later, so on. And I'm just going to skip through to these are some of the First World War images where you see photographs of things that aren't there. So you see these photographs of villages with just the sign and not the village, and so on. That's one of Corbeny, a place that isn't there. We can come back to talk about some of these. So this is Living Hiroshima, which was published in 1948 by the Hiroshima Tourist Association. So this is 3 years after the bombing, and significantly it was while Japan was still occupied by the United States. And the text is really quite remarkable. It says, "Hiroshima is alive. Visiting Hiroshima for the first time, a traveler would never realize that he had come to the city of the atomic bomb explosion." But after this, it's quite a strange book because we actually have 378 photographs, but they show the damage to the city in a very kind of peculiar way. So this spread has, it's all about the damage to plants, and in fact on the orange, there's an orange on the third image to your right, you see this kind of shadow burned onto the skin of the outside of the orange. As we move forward through time, well, there's some work. This is Hiroshima, scenes of A-bomb explosion. This was published in 1953. So this is immediately after the end of the American occupation. But it's much stronger. It uses much more graphic language and much stronger kind of rhetorical captioning of the images. So you have this double spread at the beginning, the city of death. But it's really an album of straightforward documentary images, carefully assembled and captioned. It's more like a guidebook than an authored account of the subject. And as such, it follows in the pattern of those tourist albums and guidebooks that I showed just before that were made after the First World War. And I can show you, go back into some of those. Yeah, these kinds of things. And there was a really amazing reflection on these publications by the German writer Karl Kraus, who wrote about tourism after the First World War. And he said that these publications offered unforgettable impressions of a world in which there was not a square centimetre of soil that had not been torn up by grenades and advertisements. And what horrified him in 1921, the essay he wrote, it's really worth checking out. It's called Promotional Trips to Hell. And he describes the carefully arranged trips to the battlefields, but also the strange way in which the normative forms of discourses like tourism and advertising continued despite the events of the sort of apocalyptic events that had happened. He says, "You understand that the destination has made the promotional trip worthwhile, and that the promotional trip was worth the World War." It's fairly strong. Okay, I'm just going to slip forward now. Okay, so there's an equivalent problem staged both in literature and photography in the long shadow cast by the Second World War, whether representational form, which is whether representational forms should be allowed to continue unchanged by the events that concern them. Which is to say, I think, it's the same reason that Billy Pilgrim had to come unstuck in time is the same reason that Kawada felt compelled to photograph the stains on the ceiling of the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima, which is to turn away from the conventions of documentary photography and towards something else, something more obtuse and possibly more abstract. As Marguerite Duras, who was the author of the screenplay for Hiroshima Mon Amour, wrote, all that can be done is to talk about the impossibility of talking about Hiroshima. But it's no accident that the most important and influential books on the atomic bombings in Japan were produced years after the events, when the culture of photography and the principles of documentary practice there had shifted with the influence of avant-garde thinking. And I think the turning point, it's debatable, but the turning point really is Kendamon's Hiroshima, which I'm showing here, which was published in 1959. It's a compelling and highly original conflation of documentary publication and fine art portfolio. You see it's printed with a kind of really rich gravure, and you have a cover by Miro, the surrealist artist. So it's a luxury product, but it's relentlessly tough in terms of its vision of the human cost of the aftermath of the atomic bomb. So we see an unflinching account, really, of the physical impact, both of the blast itself, with keloid scarring and blindness, but also the long-term effects of radiation poisoning, including the effects on congenital defects in the young. So looking back 13 or 14 years, Durman insists on the presence of suffering, on the presentness of suffering, with a firm belief in the humanist potential of the photograph to communicate with empathy. But even as he pushed documentary photography to its limits, arguably, Durman was still constrained by a visual language belonging to the same generation as the bombs themselves. So if Ken Durman asks us to look and look harder, Tomatsu and Kawada, by contrast, suggest that looking itself is a casualty of war. And this is something that's very interesting in the exhibition. If you get to around 15 to 20 years later, this point of looking back, there's a sudden, very different, very complex way of thinking about the past and a complex way of picturing it. So Tomatsu and the image generation of Japanese photographers, which included Kawada, really fought against the principles of photojournalism and the conventional documentary practice. As the critic Koji Taki has written, summarizing debates in Japan in the 60s. This is a quote: "The specific truth of the photograph is not objective and not a universal truth. I do not ask of the photographer an explanation of his subject. For me, it is enough that the image appear a one-time deal, irreplaceable. A one-time deal, and yet it appears from a historical field. In this field, Tomatsu has engaged his subject in a unique relationship." So both Durman and Tomatsu provided photographs for this publication, which is Hiroshima Nagasaki Document from 1961, which was really, really beautifully and richly illustrated, but also it has lots of statistical information. It has graphs and other forms of kind of canvassing of the effects. It has first-person narratives describing from survivors and so on. This publication sits on the cusp of the potential for photography in Japan at the time. So on the one hand, it's very factual with documentary images, and on the other hand, it's very poetic and full of aesthetic sophistication, very seductive sequences of photographs. And you can see, you can't read these here, but I'll read you out the captions, and that you get a sense of the different kinds of approach within the book. So one caption on the image below says, "The record of man's striving and suffering cannot help but evoke human feeling. Emotion can destroy, but it can also illuminate thought and nourish useful action. The purpose of this book is to arouse in its readers such emotions as will guide and encourage them in their efforts for peaceful progress towards those goals to which we all aspire." The other caption on the image above, which is kind of more effective in a way, it says, "Hiroshima, 1945, August 6th, 8:15 a.m. Nagasaki, 1945, August 9th, 11:02 a.m. Points of no return." So Hiroshima Nagasaki Document was not a point of no return for Tomatsu. He was very affected by his experiences working on this book, and would return to make more work there. I'll show some of it. Okay. Nagasaki has two times he would write. There's 11:02, August 9th, 1945, and there is all the times since then. We must not forget either of them. So Tomatsu not only returned to Nagasaki to make more work, he also returned to his own photographs of Nagasaki to make a second self-authored publication, which is 1102 Nagasaki, which is first published in 1966. So he had new images, he had new captions, and new forms of evidence. But despite the connections between the two publications, in terms of their evidentiary purpose, the subjects of Tomatsu's photographs set him apart from the publication with Durman and suggest a complex and evolving attitude to the past. Tomatsu still shows images of personal suffering, but he sets subtle and respectful depictions of physical damage in a very highly formalized aesthetic context. So these are some very famous images from the book where you see, as he described, the ruins of people as well as the ruins of things. And some of the images have become, in and of themselves, hugely iconic. So the watch stopped at exactly 1102 by the explosion. There are these shattered fragments of angels from the Catholic cemetery in Nagasaki. And this incredible image, which is a piece of bone fused into a metal helmet caused by the explosion. So these icons take their places within a very careful sequence, which suggest something about both what remains of the effects of the atomic bomb and also the effects on it on daily life. And it's in post-war Japan, Tomatsu described very memorably as being characterized principally by Americanization. So there's a really interesting pull between these two ideas. The other important publication from the same time is Kokuji Kawada's The Map, which was produced in Hiroshima at the same time that Tomatsu was working in Nagasaki. Kawada went to Hiroshima originally to work with Ken Durman. He was going to be his assistant, and he tells this amazing story of being in the atomic bomb dome, which you're seeing in this inverted image that's in a reflection in some water, of being inside the atomic bomb dome and noticing these the strange stains and marks on the ceiling. And he says that he wished at that time that he was really hoping that Ken Durman would not notice them, because he thought they were like the most amazing thing to photograph. He says, a dozen years after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, out of nowhere a giant black stain appeared above the basement ceiling of the atomic bomb dome. Each night the stain, which I'd seen myself, filled my dreams with horror. And Kawada's dramatic abstractions of the stain, which you see a little bit of Brassai, maybe a little bit of Aaron Siskin, taken into the theatre of war, really turn away from the idea of the post-war reality of Hiroshima and towards a poetic reimagining of it. So the scarred, blistered walls and ceiling have their own kind of bodily associations and seem all the more explicit, really, for the scope of the gaze that he levels at them. And within this catalogue of destroyed surfaces, there are other kinds of symbolic ruins. There are rising sun flags, some there, Lucky Strike packets, cigarette bottles, tourist graffiti, and also, importantly, these memorial shrines to the Japanese Zero fighters, the kamikaze special attack force pilots. And originally, Kawada intended this to be a separate project. So he was going to have one project about the remains in Hiroshima and another about the kamikaze. But in the end, he pulled them together in the map and made them into one project, which really binds these two sides of the post-war experience in Japan together. He says, the sudden encounters and coincidence of these images and the stain, he writes, became the nucleus for the map. And their embeddedness in it is also emphasized by the way that the book is. And some of you may have seen a copy of it. It's available in facsimile, so you can find it fairly easily. But it's essentially, the whole thing is double folded. So as you turn a page, you have to open that double page and look at what's inside, and then you have to fold it back, and then you can turn to the next page. So what this does is mean that you have to see the book very slowly. You can't flick through the book. It encourages a certain kind of reading, which is hugely significant. And for the exhibition, we'll have both an unbound copy of the book, so you can actually see how it works, but also this really huge installation, probably the first complete installation of that work, certainly in Europe anyway, with around 100 photographs from the book. So there are more These are by no means the last works on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'll just flip through to some of the slightly later ones. So this is Testimony of Nagasaki from 1972, and they get more militant as time goes on. 72 is another really important year in Japan. It was when the last American bases were stopped being occupied, and there was a big protest movement leading up to that event with much more kind of radicalized image making. So the text from Testimony of Nagasaki says, "Here you'll see a sublime mixture of resignation and furious rage to accuse the most inadmissible criminality against human beings. These are the records of sufferers of A-bomb in Nagasaki who've been living and struggling against death for these 25 years. So it's kind of important there that these time spans are always mentioned. So the map was published exactly 20 years later. They mention the 25 years that have passed here, so these anniversaries seem to sort of ramp up in the sort of force of the arguments. This is another one from around the same time, Keiji Ishiguro's Hiroshima Now from 1970. It's a really, again, a remarkable book. And this is Hiroshima, 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 which is published by the Student Photographers Association of Japan. It's a very strange book, actually, very abstract. You see a lot more of the sort of influence of post-war Japanese avant-garde photography in this book. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. So there's two other works about Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I want to mention, and then I'll just talk briefly about some of the other works in the show. So as time moves further forward, and we're now, I can't really read it from here, but we're now about 52 years later or something. This is work made in 1997 by João Penalva. As we move further away from the event, the kinds of work that change in character. They change to become more archaeological, more more symbolic in a way. And this is a beautiful project called Small Weeds from Hiroshima, where Penalva took plants from one of the sites that was left unused for since 1945, and made direct photograms from these weeds that had been growing in this very important site for a long time. And what he's doing really is sort of evoking a different idea of the movement of time, like that natural time is cyclical and engages rebirth and regrowth and so on, whereas human time is stuck in a certain kind of other memorial tactic. And the other work I wanted to mention, which is probably a surprise and might be surprising for you to find, that we have Araki's work in our exhibition. There are no tied-up women in any of the rooms of this very serious show, but Araki's work that we're showing is a really beautiful piece. It's from a book that he made in 2010 called Tokyo Radiation, August 6 to August 15, and it's part of a series of projects he made about the memorials of these dates. In fact, since the 1970s, he'd been making specific little albums between the dates of the first bomb dropping and the end of the war in Japan, which is August the 15th. And this is a very personal thing for him. And in fact, Tokyo Radiation is not about the atomic bomb. It's about his treatment for cancer, which he was undergoing and having radiation therapy. So the idea of his everyday life and the memory of that event that had happened a long time ago is very powerful for him. And Araki does something very strange, which he once told me about. He says, you, meaning me, I won't tell you what he called me, actually. It was extremely rude. He said, you, when you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. When I get up in the morning, I brush my eyes. And what he does is every morning he takes the same photograph. He goes out onto his balcony and he takes a photograph of the sky. And there are entire books of these skyscapes. But there's something extremely different. There's something very different, very moving about the idea of marking the anniversaries of the dropping of atomic bombs by going out and looking up at the sky and taking a photograph of the sky. And I think, in a way, so that you can see the time codes on the bottom. That's Hiroshima. That's the 6th of August, and that's Nagasaki, the 9th of August. So time, we could say, comes unstuck on Araki's balcony as he looks up at the sky that greets him every morning and thinks what has been, what might have been, and what might be. It's almost as if he's trying to remember a moment that where the bomb never fell and where the bomb will never fall. And there's a similar effect in Slaughterhouse 5. I'm just going to find this quote. Back on track. Here we go. There's a similar effect in Slaughterhouse 5 when Kurt Vonnegut introduces Celine's obsession with time in the novel Death on the Installment Plan. He says, Celine wants to stop the bustling of a street crowd. He screams on paper, make them stop, don't let them move anymore. Make them freeze once and for all so that they won't disappear anymore. And Vonnegut's war book is concerned with time, disappearance, and the impossibility of memory. Its uneasy relationships with fantasy and wish fulfillment summoned up by the sentiment of the words that I showed at the beginning from the tombstone. So in the book you have this beautiful line-drawn tombstone that says, everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. So Billy Pilgrim is a sort of amalgam of Vonnegut himself and a real-life fellow prisoner of war. And Vonnegut begins the book by saying, all this happened, more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. He doesn't say if the stuff on Tralfamadore is true or not. In offering this disclaimer, which is one of a series that introduced the book, Vonnegut's acknowledging the impossibility of accuracy when talking about the past. And when Billy Pilgrim, having come catastrophically unstuck in time, asks his alien abductors where, and more importantly, when he's told this. All time is all time. It does not change. It doesn't lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is. Take it moment by moment, and you'll find that we're all, as I've said before, bugs in amber. But maybe the most beautiful and most radical reflection on the war that he survived is the passage where Pilgrim finds himself with an hour to kill before the flying saucer comes. And part of the structure of the book, obviously, is that because he's moving around in time, he always knew when the flying saucer would come because it always came at the same time. So he finds himself coming slightly unstuck, which is a really nice phrase, to be slightly unstuck in time, shifting uneasily backwards and forwards, in very small degrees, and he finds himself watching a film about wartime bombing in reverse. And this is one of the most famous parts of the book. I'll read it out. I hope you don't mind. The formation flew backward over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were neatly stored in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad shape. Over France, though, German fighters came up and made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them in the ground, to hide them cleverly so that they'd never hurt anybody ever again. Which is really beautiful. So, this exhibition the idea is that we really follow Vonnegut's idea of what happens when you mess with time, what happens when you look at things from different vantage points, and what happens when we think about time moving forwards and backwards. And I'm just going to run through, I don't know how much longer I have, but maybe another 10 minutes or so. I'll run through a few of the other examples that aren't about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because it's slightly misleading to see just those. So we begin moments later. This is a Luc Delahaye photograph of a US bombing on Taliban positions from 2001. So this is immediately after something has happened. We're also, and this is another Delahaye from Ramadi in Iraq from 2006 with the dust hanging in the air immediately following an IED attack. And it's really important for us with the exhibition that we're showing a different kind of way of thinking about conflict photography. We're not trying to make a show about photojournalism. We're not trying to make a show about... I was saying to Jim earlier on, I don't think we really have any dead bodies. Maybe there's a few, but there's not a lot of dead bodies in the show because that's not really the point. You can go and see in newspapers and magazines, and you can see in other contexts this kind of photography of war. We're interested in a different way of marking what has happened. this, in fact, is an extremely different approach. This is Brumberg and Chanarin's The Day Nobody Died, and I know some of you may know this work. They were embedded photographers in Iraq, and instead of taking pictures whenever an event happened, they unrolled a piece of photographic paper and exposed it to light during the event happening. It's really a turning away from, a refusing to make a picture. And Don McCullin's Shell Shock Marine is a very important image for the show, because this is an image that this is several moments after something has happened. You see this very famous image of a shell-shocked Marine, but it's a picture that McCullin says could never be made again, with embedding, and the way that the relationship between photojournalists and the military has changed so much that these kinds of images we don't see very much anymore. We wanted very much to show this in that context. I will just pick out a few things. The war tourism thing in the First World War is super important, and very super important for us, because it's that anniversary year. It's the 100th anniversary of the First World War starting, and we wanted to show not only that the normal side of the images of the First World War, the pictures of trenches and soldiers and war graves and things that we usually see, but how the First World War was being understood immediately after it happened. And it was understood through this huge mass tourism event. It's one of the first, probably is the first mass tourism event in the world. I mean, there was travel to the American Civil War, I know, to visit things, but in fact the book at the top there is a rail guide to the battlefields. And there were something like 300 million postcards sent from the Western Front after the First World War. This is one of those little postcard books from that time. This is a very luxury version of the postcard book. So this is the city of Reims in northeastern France, showing the destruction of the city. And it's a really big, very luxurious portfolio that wealthier tourists could buy, showing the very artful photographs of the city completely destroyed. And this is actually the graveyard of a small church outside the city. And the image on the right's a bit of a strange one. You've got to be a real history anorak to get the joke going on there. It's a random head from a statue of a king, and then underneath there's a stone with the date of the execution of Louis XVI. He had his head cut off. Somebody was having a lot of fun. So we have very famous images, and also some more recent work, which is important in different ways. So Sophie Ristelhuber's Fay, which is made after 7 months after the end of the First Gulf War. We're showing the whole installation, which is 75 of these incredible photographs, which are both aerial photographs but also close-ups of the desert. So you kind of shift in scale from being very close to something and being very high up in the sky looking down at it. It's a really remarkable body of work, and a very different way of thinking about conflict. She's really interested in scars and the idea of scarring, and less interested in showing specific events, but more their impacts. And that's an incredible image to think of it 7 months after the end of the conflict in and of itself. We're also, as you could probably gather from the first part of the talk, there's a lot of photo books, there's a lot of publications. And I think this is really important, because the photo book is a way that ideas are circulated, as much as these great photographic projects and great installations. We're also interested in really mass circulation books. And this one, Richard Peters' Dresden, A Camera Accuses, and you see on the right the image that I showed from the Brumberg and Chanarin work before. This is a really important book, and very important at the time. There are a mixture of very well-known artists, like Jim Goldberg and others, and then some younger artists, and indeed some very young artists. There are people in their late 20s and early 30s, and this is a great thing about a show like this for Tate, because usually we show people very, very established, and this show gives us a chance to really think about different ways to represent the subject and introduce some new people. And this is a really brilliant young French photographer called Émeric Louisset. This project is called I Heard the First Ring of My Death, homage to Sardash Osman. And this is Sardash Osman, who is a Iraqi Kurd student journalist who was abducted and murdered for his writing. And what Louisset did was on the anniversary of the first year after Osman was murdered, he made unfixed photographic portraits of Osman, and he stuck them up all over the town where he was abducted. And you see that in the image on the top right. And then, because they're unfixed, as the light came up in the city, gradually they turned into black squares. So by the end of the day, you had a series of black squares a sort of memorial to the guy that had died. And this was a very risky thing to do. To stick up his picture in the first place was a very risky thing to do. It's not really a fun show, but it's got some good stuff in it nonetheless. I'm not going to talk about Jim's work because he's here. That would be rude, but he's making this incredible installation for us, which I'm very excited about. This is an important book for those of you who don't know it. War Against War. It's published in 1924 by Ernst Friedrich, who's a really important German pacifist who sent out this fantastic... He basically had these sort of posters and declarations saying, send me real pictures of what really happened in the First World War. I want to show all the pictures that nobody else would publish, that were censored, that were withheld. And some of them are very gruesome, as you can imagine. Others of them are and they're captioned in very satirical, almost kind of Dadaist ways. So this image of a statue says the Chateau of Avrancourt, before use, after use. And after use, it's just a pile of rubble. And there's a lot of that kind of thing in that book. Oh, that's a very, very special work. This is by Marc Vaux, who's a photographer better known for photographing Picasso and Giacometti and photographing in artist studios. He was actually injured in 1915, and what you're seeing there is a photograph that he made after the war where he's sitting on a little pile of rubble in the middle of the picture, and he's written an X next to himself just to his left as you look at it, and he's put, this is exactly where I was injured in 1915, and then at the top he's put reconstructed village on the left, and on the right, monument to my regiment. So it's like he's looking backwards from 9 years later, being able to be in exactly the same place, which is quite a conceptual project for 1924. Okay, this is work by, so as I said, there's some things that you may not know. Jerzy Lewczyński is a really important Polish photographer. He made 2 bodies of work in 1960 about the Second World War in Poland, and this is Wolf's Lair, which is Adolf Hitler's headquarters in Poland, which Lewczyński kind of semi-broke into and got inside and made all these photographs, which are really fantastic. We have work by Don McCullin, who's obviously very well known. This is his first foreign assignment where he went to Berlin in 1961 to see the wall just as it was just being built. That's the very early Briesbock version of the Berlin Wall. Let's skip forward. And then this is another series about Berlin by Harry Schunk and Janos Kender. They made a work called World Tour, but it only appears to have been the Berlin Wall that they did the world tour of. But it's a fantastic group of photographs of the wall and people around the wall in the mid-60s. You see these fantastic images of the watchtowers and rail tracks going into the wall and bricked up windows and doors and so on. It's a fantastic body of work. It's the map which we saw. There's several bodies of... Some of the artists are represented in the show in 2 or 3 places because a lot of their work relates to the idea of conflict and memory. And Joe Ratcliffe, who's been working in Angola and South Africa for many years, has 2 quite large bodies of work in the show. This is one of them. This is Ursula Short-Stormberg's work on the Cold War. So this is a nuclear test site in Kazakhstan. And we're showing an installation by Susan Meiselas, which is Reframing History, which is the video and installation she made where she went back to Nicaragua on the 25th anniversary of the revolution and took, I'm sure many of you know this work, but she took the pictures that she'd made in 1979 and made posters of them and put them up in the places where they were originally taken. So it's really about coming back to the place and thinking very much about how the place had changed or not. There's a huge installation of Michael Schmidt's work, Berlin since '45. This is a strange work, Nick Waplington's We Live As We Dream Alone. These are photographs of graffiti from buildings where German prisoners of war were kept in England. So it's all, and some of them very beautiful, kind of idyllic Black Forest landscapes and so on. This is another work about Munich. This is Jane and Louise Wilson's work on the North Atlantic Wall sea defences. These were huge concrete bunkers built by the Germans to defend the north coast of France. And then they've ended up now like these strange kind of, they look almost like archaeological things from another planet. They're really very strange. So we're going further and further in time. So we're now like 65, 70 years later. This is Stephen Shaw's work in the Ukraine, where he was going back to document the lives of the last surviving displaced Jewish population in the Ukraine. It's a fantastic body of work. And these are some of the only dead bodies in the show. This is another work by Luc Delahaye, and this is a Spanish Civil War grave as it's being forensically uncovered. So you're seeing skeletons as they were thrown into the mass grave, and they look sort of like they're praying, but their hands are all obviously tied together. Their hands were tied together before they were shot and thrown in there. Then we get right to the end, thinking about the First World War. So the last part of the show is entirely about the First World War, looking back from now. So it's artist work made in the last sort of 5 or 10 years about the First World War. And this is an extremely beautiful photograph, which doesn't look good in slides. And this project is... Jim told me to have some jokes, even though it's a show about... I was like, it's Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how many jokes do you want? But anyway... So I've done my best. This is possibly the last work in the show. This is, again, made by a very young artist, Chloe Dew Matthews. It's 99 years later, and it's a project called Shot at Dawn. And it's basically a series of photographs of the sites where people were executed, soldiers were executed for what was called cowardice, but was often shell shock, or some other, like, what we'd call post-traumatic stress situation. So she's making photographs at dawn of the places where people were shot at dawn, all along the Western Front. And it's a fantastic body of work. They're fantastic photographs, but it's also a really nice kind of final looking back at the First World War and thinking about how we might understand the past in a different way from looking back from 100 years. So I think we might have this one back because it's cheerier. So now, let's do this. I think that's pretty much what I had to say.